Well, yes, I hope you all remember that the jazz concert is tomorrow night. I would really like to see, more people from the community come. I have a lot of friends who would not like to darken the door of a church because, they think Christians are hypocrites and things like that. I have most of my friends are that way. It's hard to you know to be in a conversation and listening to them holding forth on just what a bunch of hypocrites the church has. But there's good things that happen in this in this community, and sponsored by one of them being this concert tomorrow night. And then I understand also the Hastings College choir is on Sunday too. So we got a week full of music ahead of us, Sunday at 3 o'clock. So we are in chapter 7, and I think, well, depending on how far we go today, but I think today and next time will be time enough, possibly, to finish this book. Uh, and I have to say, it's not been an insurmountable task, but it has been a difficult text uh, to kind of present because there's just so much information that's here. Every sentence seems to be filled with some sort of historical reference, and I find it very insightful. I understand it. It may not be the easiest book for people, who are not used to reading academic theology. It might not be the easiest book to read, but I got to tell you, some of the information, just this last chapter, has been great. We've been looking at the role of the church in the Roman context in the 5 centuries, the first 5 centuries of the church, and very specifically, what types of relationships developed between the church and their pagan neighbors. Remember, we sometimes, I think, are misled into believing that the Christian empire after Constantine, everybody became Christian and there was no more paganism left. And I think Fredrickson is certainly dispelling that illusion uh, to the extent that she makes it pretty clear that paganism is alive and well even into the time of Augustine in the 5th century. Um, Thus, we have a lot of apologetics against pagan practices. Uh, the practices she's focusing on here, though, involve the use of magic and the communication with demons. In the Roman world, in the Greco-Roman world, the idea of a demon was not one that was infused with a sense of, with evil so much. A demon could be, just one of the lower gods who, was maybe associated with a particular locale. It didn't often have an evil intent, but was nevertheless needed to be recognized through rituals and, ceremonies and things like that. People would practice things like, astrology. They would divination, all of those things that even today, we have people who like to dabble in this need on the part of human beings to connect in some sort of magical way with the order of the universe. Um, but as soon as Christianity starts to develop around, the end of the third and the fourth and fifth centuries, and starts to become very established in terms of its theology, one of the controlling mechanisms that they used was to begin to define the observance of some of these, pagan rituals to define them as evil. And this is where we get the sense of demons who are, you know, somewhat benign in the Greco-Roman world. All of a sudden, they become evil, and they become, those who are opposed to the Christian tradition. And there's already a ready theology in place that establishes the role that these demons play and how they came to be. And this is when people will start to draw on the Book of Enoch that we read several years ago now, and the story of the giants in Genesis chapter 6, You might remember that Enoch was a man who was taken up into heaven, and the book of Enoch shows, the whole structure of the cosmos and the roles that demons play and the roles that angels play. Uh, but the story goes, of course, that the angels who were put in charge of creation and watching over, human beings became enticed by human females, and they lay with those females, and their offspring became giants, and those giants then became demons who still haunt the world. So that becomes a very important uh, means by which you can begin to vilify your pagan neighbors. Like, well, what they're doing here is simply worshiping those demons that have been around since the beginning of time that Enoch gave us a little insight into. So that's where we were last time, and I know some of you, a couple of you were unable to make it, but we're looking at, the really about the third and the fourth century. We're looking at how it is that the church is starting to distinguish itself from some of the so-called pagan practices, and they're doing the best they can. However, it's really difficult to distinguish some of these practices. You might remember that prior to the Christian advent, you might say, in the Roman world, you had something that was called religio, and these were the civically sanctioned ceremonies that would acknowledge the gods and the certain uh, the spirits of a civic town, for example. Oh, can you guys still see me?
Yeah,
For some reason, I'm being signed out, and I don't know why that is. Can you see that?
looks good.
Can you still see my PowerPoint presentation?
Yes,
Yes.
Oh, okay. All right, good. I don't know what just happened. I just got, a great big message that said I was being signed out. So, but you might remember in the Roman world, there was something, the Romans had a very sanctioned civic religion that referred to as religio, right? And this was something that you did not want to brook, of course, because uh, it's what kept the Roman Empire uh, moving on apace, and kept it ordered. But there were also others that were, practicing these forms of divination that are referred to as magic. The interesting thing about this is in the early church, some of the practices start to take on what appears to be these pagan types of rituals. We have exorcism, we have people who are doing types of astrology, people who are doing having amulets, all in the name of Jesus. And people are healing in the name of Jesus instead of, trying to heal by exorcism. So it becomes very difficult to figure out, okay, well, what is good magic and what is bad magic? And this is the task that's set before the church, true religio now comes to be that religious tradition that's administered by the church. And so basically what the church does after Constantine, it just adapts that Roman paradigm and replaces the Roman religio with the accepted practices of the church. But to an outsider, there are aspects of the true religio as opposed to the magic, which has been vilified, that seem almost indistinguishable. And when we think of, some of the things that are affirmed about baptism, uh, baptism early on comes to be a means, not in terms of the high theology where you are absolved of the guilt of your original sin, as Augustine was able to explain, but baptism becomes in the earliest form of the church, a way to protect yourself against some of these, demon entities that are out there. You're somehow washed and therefore kept from, experiencing them in a very harsh way. Um, and along with this comes, whenever you're trying to decide who's in and who's out, there was this very big controversy in about in about the third century, in which bishops and priests, but primarily bishops, were recognized as being orthodox or unorthodox. And if they were seen as being unorthodox, then the question arose, well, I was baptized by this guy who's the unorthodox bishop. Do you suppose that baptism is no longer good? And some people were saying, yeah, I mean, it's all about, the power of the bishop to, be able to exact this kind of sanctification that comes with baptism. Uh, and so this becomes a real issue, right? But eventually cooler heads prevail and say, look, baptism is the work of the Holy Spirit. It's not the work of the practitioner. We have this issue today. In fact, we hear about it I hear about it all the time, especially, as a young man in Appalachia when I was, living and working there. My baptism as a child, my child baptism was, uh, infant baptism was not, didn't take place. I had to be baptized again, according to many of the people in my neighborhood, because obviously it's adult baptism that's important. Well, there's something very attractive about wanting to be baptized, in full immersion in a river or wherever. Uh, but and I was attracted to that idea, right? It's kind of a recommitment on my part. But that's not what baptism's all about. There's not this magical element to it that is dependent upon the baptizer himself. The true baptizer is the Holy Spirit. And this comes to be the Orthodox position. So I think we had a situation like this recently, and I can't remember in the church, when the trip to Israel, somebody wanted to be baptized in the Dead Sea, is that right? Or I'm sorry, in the Jordan River. Anybody remember that? Denny?
Yeah, well,
Will, you wanted to be baptized in the Jordan? No, you're muted, Will. You're muted. Oh, no.
Yeah, we were just there.
Mhm. Uh, but I don't know. I thought there was somebody in our group who went to Israel in that trip who wanted to be baptized, but they were already baptized. And they turned it into a kind of a, a renewal of their commitment to the faith, not a true baptism, but a symbolic ritual. Denny, do you know what I'm talking about?
exactly. You captured it. I think Greg wanted to reaffirm, recommit to the baptismal vows.
Yeah. And that even that is a little is seen by some very orthodox people as being not entirely acceptable. But it is uh it's a ritual that you are able to experience. I sometimes regret not having had the baptism experience, because I was a completely clueless little infant child, So this rededication idea is one that is certainly attractive, I know. But in the early church, this rededication, that was not the issue. The issue is whether or not the baptizer, the priest, was, an Orthodox, practitioner, or was he one of these people just doing magic, right? Or along those lines. Um, and also, when we think about the Eucharist, how do you explain to somebody in the second or third century who has a very, kind of magical mindset that what is happening in the Eucharist is not bad magic, but it's good magic. This bread and this wine turns into the body and the blood of Christ. Well, that has all the trappings of a magical transformation. And so, trying to determine, what the so-called good magic, if you don't mind me calling it that, and the bad magic was a way for the church to begin to establish its sense of identity and also to control the lives of its parishioners as well. So, any thoughts about that?
Dan,
Yeah,
I come away from the entire book, but particularly chapter 7, so impressed with what Paula Fredrickson has done in creating an anthropology, sociology case study if
yeah.
we only had the data. And I think she does a marvelous job of saying, whoa, wait a minute. The elites were a tiny, tiny sliver, and what was going on in terms of any Christianization and syncretist. I think this notion of syncretism, is so deep in anthropology
Mhm.
of the melding of two religious traditions, uh,
Right.
as if there was an alternative, and I think she's done a marvelous job of pointing that out.
And not only pointing it out, but also she talks about how these things are happening in various registers is the word that she used, which I think is pretty good, because it's language out of accounting, I think. But there's a high register where the intellectual work is being done, and then there's the so-called low register where the religion of the masses is happening. And and one of those is deemed as being, acceptable, and the other is being deemed as generally unacceptable. But she points out very clearly that those working in the higher register are drawing on pagan beliefs and pagan practices in some cases just as much as those in the lower register. Uh, so that's what I appreciated most about this chapter. Um, Let me move ahead here.
Well, I
Um,
think for the,
Go ahead.
for the average folks out there in the street, the universe had to be scary as can be in terms of trying to explain why things are happening. They had to make sense of that.
Mhm.
And this is, it's no surprise, I guess, that magic, became, a very comforting uh,
Yeah,
balm, if you will. And the notion of a better life awaits you, after death, um, so important to
yeah,
mental health.
yes, yes. And the potential for manipulating that is also incredible, you
Oh,
know. Yeah. Uh, but what the church is trying to do is to neutralize this pagan tradition. Good luck with that, right? Because there's something very primal about everything that we're talking about. And I keep coming back. We're not quite at this place in the chapter yet, but the oldest, most fundamental religious impulse is ancestor worship. And there is a sense of, still being in communication with the ancestors. Well, that can over time morph into, connections with the gods and communications with the gods and drawing on magical means to try to manipulate or influence the gods. And this is what we're talking about here, right? You can't just say, oh, you can't do that, because it's not coming from here. It's coming from somewhere deep in our genetic memory. Uh, so much so, I mean, and the church kind of puts this veneer over it, like, oh yeah, we've neutralized that paganism, when in fact they've done nothing of the sort.
Dan, if I
Yeah,
could,
please, Mac.
you
Yeah,
know, one of the things, this idea of magic and the supernatural, it's not appearing on a blank canvas. I mean, read
yeah.
the Gospels. Jesus,
Right.
you know, you talk about exorcisms and you know, walking on water, and to the uh, non-Jewish, which we are at this point in her,
Right.
you know, they're looking at all of this literally, certainly.
Hmm.
And, you know, he's a magician.
Right.
I mean, you know, that Jesus is basically a miracle worker and a magician. Now, as you're right, you know, so one of my professors said back in that day, and what Denny was saying about how terrifying the world must have been. You know, somebody who's a miracle worker, they were a dime a dozen. You
Yeah.
know, there was a uh, common character in that society, but magic certainly, the supernatural, that was part and parcel.
There's that's absolutely correct. And there's an interesting parallel here between the writings of Paul, who in many ways was working in the higher register, right? And he had his understanding of the demons and who they were. But then the writing of Mark, the Gospel of Mark, 20 years after Paul, um, Jesus is precisely that, as you point out. I mean, look at what happens with the Gerasene demoniac, right? He magically takes these demons and who are in the man, who are legion, and puts them into the pigs. And this whole gospel is a cosmic, apocalyptic confrontation between the force of good and the force of evil. And Jesus has, in fact, he is accused by the Pharisees of, of being an evil magic worker in this. And so we do see it reflected in the Gospels. It is, it's kind of weeded out by the time you're reading the Gospel of John, but as Fredrickson is pointing out, it is going gangbusters among the 95% in the world of the proletariat, if you want to call it that, the regular Am Haaretz, as it's referred to, the people of the land. Um, so neutralizing this pagan tradition becomes, um, becomes one of the objectives of the church. I want to also point out here, I've got this bust of Pythagoras. A lot of this so-called paganism and magic and manipulation of the elements has its source in Pythagorean philosophy. We know Pythagoras as a mathematician, but he was also a philosopher who had some pretty interesting ideas. For example, breaking wind, if you will, flatulence was prohibited because it was a way that the soul escapes the body, right? And for that reason, Pythagoras and his ilk, uh, pro they prohibited eating beans. And so Pythagoras had some really interesting ideas, but it's all based upon this idea that there is geometrical order in the universe, and understanding that order means there are means of manipulating it as well. So this magic, doesn't necessarily have its source in the so-called illiterate folks of the region, right? Pythagoras himself is one who is known to have these kinds of leanings, and there were many Pythagoreans who practiced a variety of rituals that have their source in his philosophy. Um, but like going back to those registers, the lower register where pagan rituals are being practiced is where the people of the land were doing their work. But in the higher register, the people who were writing the theological treatises that we have access to, we have a different type of paganism that is influencing their thinking. They're not Jews anymore. They're not thinking according to the, Jewish worldview. They are full-fledged Platonic and Neoplatonic philosophers who are taking the story of, the gospel and taking the stories of the letters of Paul and applying these pagan philosophical principles to it. This is something that was being done. We've already mentioned this, won't spend much time on it, but I mentioned Philo of Alexandria. This is a person that I'm very, very interested in. He was a contemporary of Jesus. You can see, he was born in 20 BCE, before Jesus, but died in 50. So 70 years old when he dies. But he was able to take the Hebrew Bible and the stories of Moses, the stories of Abraham, and apply Platonic principles to them and to say, look, these are just, in many ways, Plato's philosophy being played out in narrative form. You might remember several weeks ago when we were talking about Philo, he's the one who came up with the idea of the logos as being ideas in the mind of God. And that would later be interpreted and translated into Christ, the logos, who becomes incarnate. But this idea that the human mind was the means by which you would come to know God, and the human mind was the means by which you would control the body, which was, always, tempting you away from the order of this perfect universe. This is already present in Philo. So you have people like Tertullian, and certainly at the other end of the centuries, in 500, in the 5th century, I'm sorry, you have people like Augustine drawing on pagan philosophy, So you have this two-tiered intellectual society that Frederick's, and I love this chapter because she points it out so clearly. You have the pagan magicians who are condemned, but at the same time, you have the pagan philosophers who are being adopted for the establishment of an orthodox understanding of Christianity. So here's this quote from page 184: Christian exorcists, healers, and those who consulted astrologers were condemned as pagans. But these repudiated Christians were simply doing in a lower register what the intellectuals were doing in a higher register, drawing on cultural material that lay at hand in order to make sense of their world and to exercise some control over it. So let me stop there and see if there are any comments you want to add to that.
Dan, before we leave demons behind, I think let me suggest that they're still with us. There was a funeral, I believe, last Sunday of fairly epic proportions that made it pretty clear the fusion of the secular, the sort of Christian,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, probably an audience of several million, in person and on television and social media. And
yeah,
that is a huge phenomena, I think.
yeah,
It's
right.
been mobilized.
Yeah, and it's kind of scary too. By the way, I'm glad to see that we're all here after the rapture yesterday, because I had some questions about that. But apparently, I mean, speaking of, uh, manipulating ideologies and theologies, somehow it came about that the rapture was supposed to happen yesterday. I I don't know where this got introduced, but it was, all over social media, or so I understand, that, people were coming up with strategies for taking people's cars who have been abandoned on the highway, after they've been raptured, and the so-called pagans were having a great fun with it, you know. But apparently there were some people who were very serious about this whole thing. Um, you know, and when the idea of the rapture just isn't something that really coincides well with a so-called scientific worldview. And the ability or the insistence on the part of on so many to set aside a scientific worldview, which is how we live in our world today. You know, we assess data, we look at probabilities and things like that. But it just seems like, if I can call it a demonology, there is some sort of, I want to say in the most general way, there is some sort of demon possession, so to speak, that is taking over the minds of many people they're taking on an alternative worldview that is based in magical thinking. Am I being too harsh about that? You know, I'm thinking about our our health secretary or our health director of the CDC being fired and things like that. This is scary. This is scary stuff. Uh, Anybody want to chime in? Go ahead, Denny. I see you.
Uh, Tylenol really is dangerous stuff, you know.
Oh boy.
Pregnant women just need to man up. Oh, man.
Right. It was fun watching Trump try to pronounce acetaminophen, though. Somebody actually had to whisper it in his ear. I mean, uh, you know, if you're going to go on international television and start claiming that Tylenol is a problem, you better be able to pronounce you know, the chemical name for it, right? Uh, or an alternative name for it. But there is something that's very attractive about this demon thinking, right? We know in a world where there are laws and there are probabilities that we can acknowledge in a scientific way that there are things that probably won't happen, right? We probably won't be raptured up into heaven, as Paul said. I hate to break it to you, but I just can't fathom that the God that I worship works that way, right? But people want to believe that kind of stuff. They want to believe that there are laws that can be set aside in the in the service of God's will. And it's everywhere, and it's starting to run a little rampant as far as I'm concerned. Any thoughts on demons before we move on?
It was probably the immigrants that were raptured.
Oh, oh my gosh. Yeah, that's not even a very, I don't want to, I'm descending into a darkness here. There's just so much that's happening. So anyway, I'll try to come back into the light for a minute here. But thanks for that insight, Denny. Well, let's move on to I was so fascinated with this. I mean, it's stuff that I'd already known, but in this context, it it became so clear. Just the way that we manage time comes to be a significant part of the work of the church. Remember, you've got all of these civic celebrations that are happening with respect to the religio of the Roman world, and these things are persisting. And rightly so, because these are ways for people to come together to acknowledge their, well, I mean, think about what happens at a Husker football game. That's basically a civic feast day, right? You've got your gods that you are supporting and uh, appealing to, and you have your rituals, and you know you're praying that the gods will shed their grace on you with a win, and that of course just transfers on to your good fortune. Uh, this is what the civic feast days were like in the Roman world. I mean, there was great existential investment in these kinds of things, but they also drew the loyalty of the church, faithful away from the church. So there were people like Tertullian, in the second century all the way to the fifth century, and Augustine, who saw them as the Pompa Diabolic, right? These diabolical events. And this became, a real problem until finally the church had to just capitulate in some ways to the power that these things had over the people. For example, the festival of the Roman New Year. This is one that we still, to this very day, celebrate. Was preceded by all kinds of feasting and dancing and debauchery, you might say. But it was the beginning of a new year. Interesting. I don't know if you're aware of the Roman calendar, but what an interesting story. I'll say it very quickly, but um, originally, and this was prior to Julius Caesar, the Roman calendar had 300 days. I think it was really actually 301 days. Uh, but there was a month of 30 or 31 days that was devoted to a Roman god. For example, March was, devoted, it was the month of Mars. Um, April, May, June, Juno, the god Juno. Um, but then Juno, after June, the months were just numbered. I think there was should be March, April. Quintus, Sextus, Septus, they were just numbered. Quintus being the fifth month, Sixtus being the sixth month, then Septus, I don't know if I'm saying the right words, but those were the Latin terms. We still retain those numerical names for the month of September being the seventh month, uh, September, October, the eighth month, November, December. But there were only 10 months, Dec for December, November, Novum for nine, or the number nine being in there. But there were only 10 months. I'm saying this just to show you that megalomania has a strong history in our world. Julius Caesar came up with a new calendar referred to as a Julian calendar, in which he said, I'm so great, I want to have my own month. So between Juno and the sixth month, is that right? They came up with this month that we call July, right? Julius Caesar's July. Well, Julius's little nephew or adopted nephew, Caesar Augustus, says, "Well, I want my month too," and so August is the month that we come up with, and after that we have September, October, November, and December. But then they had to add two more months, January and February, and this is how we came up with our so-called Gregorian calendar. But I tell you all of that, and you may know this already, but I tell you all of that just to simply show the megalomaniacal aspect of some of these Roman emperors. They wanted time immemorial to acknowledge their names, for forever. So anyway, the Roman calendar had in it all of these feast days, and they were acknowledged at various parts of the Roman Empire. But then if the church wanted to separate itself from some of these Roman feast days, then they had the question of, should we come up with our own calendar? And this is the beginning of our so-called liturgical calendar, right? Where we look at things like Advent, and then of course, Epiphany, and then eventually, Lent, and then Easter, and then ordinary time. But it was never able to take over completely. The Christian calendar got basically subsumed into the Roman calendar. And we know this to be the case because, when the church tried to get very heavy-handed with all of these celebrations, it never took hold that the church could take over the manipulation of time, let's say. So there's the so-called deluxe calendar that was found. There was another name for it that Fredrickson doesn't use, and I'm wondering if I'm thinking of the same calendar, but she does refer to this deluxe calendar, in which, it was a calendar that was made for a Roman aristocrat. And it's a great historical find because what it shows that in around 350 BC, or excuse me, 350 of the Common Era, there was a Roman aristocrat, who presumably Christian, who maintained this calendar that showed all of the Roman feast days that were still being observed, as well as an Easter cycle in there as well. But it is primarily a Roman calendar. So, when we're talking about syncretism, I think this is a great place to start with, with the way that we determine time. And then the classic example of this is the Saturnalia festival. We know that January 1st was the beginning of the Roman New Year. But Saturnalia was a festival that was preceded by, a week to 10 days of just anticipation, celebration, and it was to commemorate the birth of the sun, and it took place on the winter solstice. Actually, December 25th was the Saturnalia festival. Well, the church, seeing how incredibly important this festival was, wasted no time in establishing that Saturnalia festival date as the date of the birth of the Son, S-O-N, Christ. And thus we have a perfectly syncretized Roman and Christian calendar. So if you have any allusions to the fact that it was on December 25th that Joseph and Mary took their little trip down to Jerusalem, not probably likely that it was December 25th the date on which Jesus was born. Did you all know this pretty much, or is this relatively new information?
Good.
Yeah, fun stuff. Okay, any questions about this or comments? The next section, we're getting towards the end of this chapter, also had to do with the baptizing of the city of Rome. If Christianity was going to have a geographical center, and if Christianity had already taken over kind of the Roman imperial infrastructure, then it seemed to be a matter of course that Rome would become the holy city, even though Jesus never spent any time in Rome, and the time that the apostles spent there was not exactly a leisurely vacation. This is where both Peter and Paul were executed, basically. And there is a kind of irony to this, that the city that serves as the center of the Christian church is the very city from which the execution of Jesus was sent out, right? The Romans were no friends. At least in the New Testament, we don't see anything that can be said that's good about the Romans, right? They're the ones who are really ultimately responsible for crucifying Christ. They killed Peter and Paul. The book of Revelation, of course, refers to Rome as the Babylon, the whore of Babylon, you know, and the seven-headed monster, referring to the seven hills upon which Rome was built. But the church had one way of saying, you know, this is important, and this city is the place that Jesus had in mind, because, and notice the logic here, in Matthew 16:18, where Jesus, it's kind of a turning point in the Gospels, or at least the Synoptic Gospels. Jesus is saying, you know, who are people saying that I am? And some say, and the response is, well, some say you're Elijah, some say that you are, you know, John the Baptist return. Then Jesus asked Peter, and Peter, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ, you are the Messiah. And Jesus says, you know, well said, and on this rock, Peter, I will establish my church. Well, since Peter was killed in Rome, and Peter is the person upon whom the church is to be established, right? The rock, then it was a matter of logic that Rome would become, you know, the center of the Christian church. This was, you know, and this wasn't a given from the very beginning, right? There was a lot of, you know, jockeying for position on this, but there was much about Rome that presented itself as the obvious choice, not least of which is the fact that it was the imperial Roman city, the Roman imperial city. So it is in Rome where the church really starts to develop as a social institution for the ruling elite. And this under the leadership of a pope by the name of Damasus, not Damascus, but Damasus. And Damasus did what anybody trying to build a church does, is that he seeks out wealthy benefactors. And it so happens that most of these benefactors were wealthy women, right? But so we can presume wealthy widows too. It's these widows that are supporting the development of the church in Rome in the early centuries of the church. So much so that, you know, it starts to become kind of, yeah, kind of smarmy, if I can use that word, kind of questionable as to, you know, what the actual relationship is between the bishop and, you know, his you know, administrators and these women, right? So finally, some people had to say, look, you know what, why don't you guys just separate a bit, because people are starting to have questions. But then the last thing that becomes really important, and we don't really talk about this much, because in the Protestant tradition, we do not read a version of the Bible that's based upon a Latin translation. Well, one of the things that served to solidify the centrality of Rome is the Vulgate, which is the Latin translation of the Bible that was done by Jerome. And thus, it's the use of this Latin that is able to take the Bible and, you know, bring it to the so-called common people. And the common people were significant. There were many of them. But I can't go into that because we're kind of pretty much on our time. I'm hearing a timer someplace, so somebody else has got that. I don't know if it's in my house or not. Any last words or comments before we move on? I don't know where that's coming from. Well, when we come back, the best section of this chapter is the one that is yet to be discussed, and that is the one of, you know, how the masses. I mean, we know a lot about the texts that were written by the intellectuals at this time, but Fredrickson kind of puts together, you know, based upon the archaeological data that you know we can find, an image of what the early church, in terms of the masses, must have looked like. They weren't the ones going to the buildings on Sunday, these buildings that were being, built by the wealthy, because there were social uh, divisions there, but they were spending most of their time outside. And the place where they would congregate typically would be in cemeteries. So, or at least this is what Fredrickson's conjecture is, and it makes perfect sense, and we'll talk about that next time. So, if there are no comments or questions or thoughts,
Dan, I was just fascinated with the cemetery comment that Frederickson makes in terms of the very vital importance of Day of the Dead ceremonies in Hispanic culture,
yeah,
particularly Central America and Latin America.
yeah,
And if any of you ever get a chance to attend one of these in, a Latin country, do it.
yeah.
It is so interesting. I think we call it hmm, All Souls Day,
Also, yeah, well, yes.
sort of.
We call it Halloween, basically, or All Hallows Eve, or Samhain is the Celtic celebration. But Central Community College observes this every year up in Grand Island, but they do it in early November, and it is a sight to behold as well. But you can see exactly where I was going with this, Denny, when you can look at the photos that I decided to use as part of the PowerPoint presentation. But this is what you're referring to.
Beautiful.
Yeah, the Day of the Dead. And it helped me to realize just what a milk toast bland tradition I come from as a Protestant, as a waspy Protestant. We didn't have any of this stuff. Man, look how fun that around something that's kind of taboo, right? Death. Yeah, there's no fear of death here. It is, part of the community. So that's what we'll be talking about next time. But that is a week away. So, and then after that, we're going to be looking, if it's agreeable to everybody, at Walter Brueggemann's The Prophetic Imagination. I still haven't found my copy, but I don't mind buying a new one because it is such a good book. So, any final thoughts or words?
To see, to be in a cemetery in southern Mexico on Day of the Dead and observe families with little kids and older kids and grandmas and coming together to clean and repaint, the tombs and
Yeah,
of their loved ones that have gone on, and to feed them and leaving oranges and specially baked Day of the Dead pan dulce,
the,
shoot, Day of the Dead bread.
yeah,
Dia de los Muertos pan is just stunning because of seeing the tremendous bonding between all generations in that
right.
family that are really hard to find anymore in advanced Western society. I
Yep. And that's the source of my lament as well. I had a tradition in my childhood that was similar to this. I'll tell you about it next time. But nothing, you find yourself feeling very much left out of just a powerful tradition when you observe this as a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. I go every year up to the CCC and observe their rituals with the Day of the Dead and look at the altars and everything. And I think to myself, you know, what could have happened with my imagination and creativity had this been a part of my upbringing? But we'll talk about that next time.
Would you let us
Thank you,
know,
everybody.
Would you
Go
let me
ahead.
know when that is going to occur this year?
Yeah,
So
it's usually the
find
first
out.
weekend in November, but I will find out and I'll let you know.
Thanks.
All right. I will see you all later and thank you. Have a good week.